Welcome to Books in the Freezer, a podcast dedicated to the disturbing world of horror fiction. I'm your host, Stephanie, and today I am joined by author Gemma Amor to talk about motherhood and horror. So, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I feel like we've been trying to set this up for a while, and circumstances have been against me, so I'm really happy that I'm finally here.
I'm happy you're finally here too, and this is such a good topic. And there's so much meat to this topic.
There is, and it's interesting that it's a theme that I think I come back to again and again in my own fiction and in the fiction that I consume. And obviously, even before I had children, actually, I was always, perhaps because of issues in my own childhood and with my own mother, like that relationship, I think particularly with girls and their mothers as well, it can be very complicated and very strained in some ways and very intense in other ways. And so, yeah, it's definitely been something that I've explored in fiction again and again. And I imagine I will continue to do so. Because motherhood covers such a broad spectrum of feelings and emotions and facets of like humanity, everything from bad mother to good mother. Yeah.
Absolutely. I was going to say, as I was kind of breaking down, like, because it's so broad, like we could do separate episodes on different facets of motherhood and horror. I was thinking, like, I don't know if I want to do like the horrors of having a bad mom, but as I was reading these books, I'm like, that is a part of it a lot of the time.
It is a lot of it. It's that generational trauma as well that I think we don't talk about a lot, where it's not necessarily just that you had a bad mother or a bad role model, and that certainly does play into it in a lot of these stories, but it's like the idea that certain generations weren't comfortable being compassionate or talking about emotions and feelings, and how that then manifests in you as a child when you then become an adult and you struggle with certain things and other things, like how and I think about this a lot, how acceptable corporal punishment was when I was a kid. Smacking and hitting and punitive punishment and shame and all of those things that were just generational back then that aren't so much now. And the damage I think that's done on a wide swathe of kind of the millennial generation, certainly. But it's then when you combine that with the sort of complexities of being female, being a woman, expectations that differed generationally as well from mother to daughter and so on. There's just so much there. Like you said, there's so much meat you could write a dozen stories about motherhood and come up with a different angle every single time, which is what I love about the topic in general, but also it makes me feel kind of squirrely whenever I read one that really nails it.
There is that vulnerability that like, oh, I'm seen, but it's also like I feel validated, but also like you see me.
Yeah. Or you have a completely different reaction where you come across a mother in fiction or in a movie or whatever, and you're like, oh my God, no. It just like, this is so opposed to everything in me and my values. But then you start to question yourself. You're like, well, actually, because when you become a parent, you then assess everything that you were given as a child from your parents. And then when you see other parent figures in media, you stop like... It's the same whenever you see a movie now, or if I see a movie now where violence towards children is a part of the narrative. Right? Before I had children, I was able to be just a spectator and watch that. Now, whenever I watch anything like that or try and consume it, it's too personal. I'm too close to the topic. Like, I can't just be a spectator. I'm like an active participant in that story, because I'm constantly thinking, what would I do in this situation? Or if this was my child, or, it's so... I'm not implying that if you don't have children, you can't access those themes and relate to them and stuff, but there's something that's happened in me personally since I had a kid that stops me from being able to just sit back and view things and read things. And actually, I kind of have to like secondhand experience them whenever I'm reading or watching, which makes it really grueling sometimes.
I remember after I had my daughter, like I was reading a few books that had like pregnancy related like body horror, labor stuff, and I was like, I
Yeah.
can't do it, or like harm to babies, which I think was something maybe I was a little more jaded to before
Yeah.
having kids. No, I'm like,
Yeah.
that's
It's
tough.
pregnancy in particular is still a really bad one for me. Like, I just can't. I can't. Any kind of pregnancy related horror, like I watch it. It gets me on such a visceral level, because actually that's a whole nother topic in itself, like body horror and pregnancy and childbirth and all of that stuff.
Oh,
Is
absolutely.
a big conversational topic, which I almost like shy away from, because I've never wanted to be the sort of person that would potentially frighten somebody else who is in the early stages of that journey. But I also find that it's not spoken about a lot, and not very honestly, from woman to woman in general. I think perhaps because part of us is afraid of not wanting to fearmonger, and put our own experiences onto others, but also because it's everybody's experience is so intensely personal and different, traumatic, so we don't really want to talk about it.
It absolutely is. And I mean, with pregnancy, I feel like, I don't know, maybe the way I grew up, I feel like there was a narrative that like this was the right way to
Mm.
have a pregnancy and
Mm-hmm.
give birth. And maybe you were a coward if you took a
Mm-hmm.
different way out of it. And I don't know, there's no easy way to go through a
No.
pregnancy. There's no easy way to give birth. Like a C-section is still hard. You still have to
It's
heal from that. Getting
C-section
an
is
epidural
incredibly
is
hard.
hard.
It's a major operation. That's what always makes me
Yeah.
laugh. They're like, "Oh, you had a people, the narrative around having your belly sliced open, and then that somehow not being indicative of you trying hard enough or giving birth properly." And you're like, "Can I swear on here?"
Yeah.
like, bitch, somebody sliced me open, man. That's
Yeah.
like, I had a major operation. This is the
Mhm.
most, I don't know. There's so much we could get into. There's so
Yeah.
much. This entire
There
topic is,
yes.
it's such a huge one. Like you say, it's,
Yeah.
yeah,
As I was like breaking it up into sections, I'm like, these could
there's
be
too much.
episodes. But yeah, I had epidural with both of mine, and the first one took, and I mean, epidural is a spinal tap that you're
Right.
getting. It's like a whole
Yeah.
thing. And the first one took, and the second one only numbed half of my body,
Oh my
like my
God. That,
right side. So my left side felt
all of my
everything.
innards just clenched when you said that. Like, like, oh, the
Yeah.
whole,
So
yeah. And the
I
whole
just mean,
idea
yeah,
that
there's
you're
no
supposed
easy
to,
way.
there's no easy way. And actually, interestingly, a lot, I know this is completely like off topic now from books and movies, but like, so many women are sort of taught before they give birth that giving into any sort of pain relief is not the right way, like you
Mhm.
said. And I actually ended up waiting 3 days before I had an epidural,
Oh my
in
word.
an induced labour, and by that point I was nearly dead. And it's ridiculous. And if I could go back and do it now, I would just like instantly just give me that stuff. I do always remember that the mild comedy moment in my horrific experience of giving birth was finally signing the paper that said, yes, I consent to
Yeah.
having this spinal tap. And I had a moment where I looked up, and I had been in labor for like 3 days, and I was completely naked, and I was just covered in every
Yeah.
fluid under the sun, and I was sweaty, and my bits were hanging out. And the epiduralist walked in, and he was, on God's green earth, the most handsome man I've ever seen in my entire life. It was like he walked in and there was a halo of light behind him, and like angels were singing. I was just this like amorphous blob screaming on the bed, covered in all of my own juices. And I was like, why? Why now?
Oh my
Do
gosh.
you
They
remember
gave you
that
the
vividly?
like most handsome anesthesiologist in here.
And yeah, so I hope I never run into him again.
I mean, there's so much. And I mean, I know you said a lot of your work deals with motherhood, but I think your book that came out last year, I think probably most plainly deals with the subject of motherhood, full immersion.
Sure.
And it was one of our top books of last year. It was one of Rachel's favorites.
Thank you. Yes, yeah, Rachel has been doing a wonderful job talking about that book on her YouTube channel and on your podcast. And actually, I'm immensely grateful for that, because I think So yes, it is an extremely personal book, and it deals directly with the theme of motherhood and mothers who struggle with postnatal issues. And I think by default of that being the most honest book, because it's essentially an autobiography in many ways, it's been quite inaccessible for a lot of my normal readers. And by that, I mean, I write horror, I write in the genre, and I write serial killers and ghosts and spooky things and monsters, and they're always rooted in a very human theme, and they're always about people at heart. But this one in particular wasn't overtly a genre piece. It was a blend of many different genres, and it wasn't really about the horror. It was about my experience first and foremost. And I think that actually made it one of those books where people, they bought it, which I'm incredibly grateful for, but they've just put it to one side until they're ready, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm finding that people now are starting to, they've had it for months and months, but they're only starting to pick it up now and get into it. And I do understand. It's not an easy book. It's, I sort of affectionately call it, it's about miserable women's shit, which I always use it to describe if anybody asks, which is doing it a bit of a disservice, really. But it is an exploration of postnatal issues, intrusive thoughts, motherhood, and what that looks like, and what it looked like for me, particularly when my son was very young. And just the damage that can be done to you as a new mother without the right support. And also, I wanted to break open this kind of recurring myth that postnatal depression is something that you have when babies are very young. The stereotype that you often see in movies of the kind of raving lunatic woman who can't go near her child, who is aggressive towards her child, who can't touch it, who abandons their baby, Yes, a lot of postnatal issues do come out in that way, but there's a much more insidious form of it where you can function as an adult, as a mother, as a parent in every way except mentally and emotionally. And what often happens when you have a kid is you sort of lock yourself and your own needs away in a box for a good number of years because you're in survival mode and you're trying to keep your baby happy and fed and alive, and you don't look at yourself and how you're feeling at all. You just don't have any time or energy or capacity. So often what happens is when your kid starts to get a little bit older, a bit more self-sufficient, suddenly these issues rear up, as they did with me, and then they take over. And I was personally very poorly for about an 18-month period, which is all a bit foggy for me, when my kid sort of was about 2 until he went to school at 4, which is when I sort of started the healing process. So it's I think there are a lot of women out there who have young children who are perhaps not able to recognize what they're struggling with is postnatal in nature, that it isn't normal to feel the way that they feel, that it, yes, having kids is hard, but at what point does it become something that you need to attend to medically? And so I wanted to just write a little bit more about that, about how you can be okay on the surface and be functional, but underneath everything is just dying and breaking down and going wrong. Yeah.
Absolutely. So you said with people kind of discovering it now, not discovering it, but they've had it and they're finally in a place where they can read it. Have they reached out to you about being seen with the work?
I've had some wonderful messages from women who, and from men actually, whose partners have been going through the same thing. I have had some messages from people who said, I've never read a written description of it that accurately summed up how I felt as I did with this book, which to me means everything, because there's a certain amount of tawdriness associated with, like, I guess the act of monetizing your own trauma and turning it into a novel that you sell, Like, I really struggled with whether or not this book should even sort of see the light of day. I originally just wrote it for myself as a kind of form of therapy, ironically. And, I really grappled with I guess the like internal ethics of whether or not I should have sold it to a traditional publisher. And I essentially kind of made money out of my own pain. But then I also figured, well, it's my pain. Why not? I might as well make it work for me. But, you know, the main reason I wanted that story out there was because I felt like it was something that we needed to have a conversation about, and that we need to speak about much, much more widely than we do. And like we were saying earlier, there are so many aspects of motherhood and pregnancy and childbirth and everything that follows and everything that goes before that just don't get spoken about in a kind of widely accepted way. And I'm sad about that, because I feel like people's experiences could be better if we had more honest conversations about these things, even if they are uncomfortable conversations. So, yeah, I've had some really lovely messages from people. I've had some pretty decent critical reviews as well, which has been nice for me. It's my first traditionally published book, so it's the first time I had a publicist working on it, and it was going out to the kind of literary outlets that I've never really gone near before as a self-published and indie author. And there's something really gratifying about getting a review in Literary Journal, or, you know, it's nice because it's sort of, your ego doesn't need it, but like the sense of imposter syndrome that comes up on you when you're launching your debut, like traditionally published novel, and you see it on a shelf in a bookshop or whatever, there's a huge sense for me of imposter syndrome. So those reviews and that reception really helped with that. Like, you know, it really helped me to go on and write the next book, which is an ongoing struggle. But yeah.
I can see that. I mean, that's a lot. But I mean, speaking of your next book.
Yeah.
Yeah, you announced yesterday. Was it? I mean, I thought I had seen you hint to it before, but I don't know if yesterday was the like official announcement for the Once Yellow House.
Yes. So I sneakily launched a new book yesterday, the ebook version of it, and the paperback version is like imminent as we speak. And it's something I've been working on for a while with Cemetery Gates Media, who are a wonderful indie publisher who are just going from strength to strength. And I've had a relationship with them since I first really started in this gig back in sort of 2018. And it's a novel called The Once Yellow House, which was supposed to be a novella and has bloated into a bit of a small novel. And it's interesting, having done the traditional side of things. This was really nice for me to return to a time frame of like less than 6 months, where I could just bash out a novel and then we hit publish and then it's live within like the hour, you know. And I love that immediacy, and traditional publishing is lovely as well, but it can take like 2 years from signing contract to it hitting the shelves, and that's a long old lead time. So this was a nice return back to like that kind of snappy, fast, bish bash bosh style of publishing that I love, and I love indie for that. It's an epistolary horror collection of fictional first-hand accounts of a notorious massacre that takes place at a house called, sort of locally known as the Once Yellow House, which is a play on a property called the Yellow House, where Vincent van Gogh once stayed in France when he was very poorly. And I won't spoil too much about it, because it's one of those books that I started writing that turned into something completely different by the end. But it's about the colour yellow and art and horror and occult. Ooh. And a subtle exploration of the nature of abuse in relationships, because that seems to be the only thing I can ever write about. And it's a bit of a departure for me, and I really had fun writing it. There's lots of like illustrations and footnotes and little things that I've put in there that just were interesting for me to research, and as a writer, interesting for me to try and piece together like a bit of a jigsaw puzzle. And it's like most things I write, it's not a beginning, middle, and an end. It's sort of something the reader has to kind of put together themselves. Because I don't believe in like patronizing the reader to the point where you have to lead them by the hand through every single page. I think having a little bit of a puzzle to solve is not a bad thing sometimes, like in that kind of House of Leaves style, or the other one, the J.J. Abrams book, the one about the ship, the Theseus or something like that, I want to say. But yeah, I'm drawn to books where you have to try a little bit harder.
I mean, there's a satisfaction in that as a reader too. Yeah. Being a part of feeling like you're a part of the story and like.
Yeah. Well, this is so I asked Eric LaRocca to write the foreword for this because he is like the master of epistolary fiction, and actually we were on a panel together at StokerCon last year talking about epistolary fiction, I think with Gemma Files as well, if I remember rightly. And one of the things we both discovered was that the reason we love and we're drawn to that particular form of fiction is because it feels really illicit. It feels like you are having access to somebody's private thoughts that you shouldn't be. And that makes you immediately feel a little bit more invested, but also quite uncomfortable. And interestingly, that sort of segues into one of the books I think we've got for this interview, which is We Need to Talk About Kevin, which is one of the most obvious forms of epistolary fiction, I think, that starts you off down one path. Then you figure out what's going on, and then all of a sudden there's like a few gut punches at the end where you just didn't see it coming. Well, I didn't. And the whole thing feels so grimy and sad and illicit, like I said, and like you're getting this first-hand view of somebody's life falling apart that you shouldn't have access to and shouldn't be witness to, but you are, and you can't really help being dragged along in the story. And I love that kind of fiction. I love it so much. I just think it's really compelling, and I think that's why I've been drawn so much to like No Sleep and, you know, all of that kind of format of storytelling, because it feels real and believable and like it could happen to you. So
I love that. I love epistolary fiction. You're right. There is like an intimacy in that. Yeah. I mean, as I was breaking this down, like there was so many. I have like the horrors of pregnancy, which we talked about. There's the horrors of having a responsibility over a child and what that child will become, and how much do you blame yourself for what that child becomes, which I think is a perfect encapsulation of We Need to Talk About Kevin.
It really. So the thing about this book is that, like we were saying before, the experiences, I read it 3 times now. The first time I read it in my 20s and it blew me away. I think just because the story was so horrifying, because the reveals were so horrifying, because the sense of voice was actually really one of the strongest senses of character that I've ever come across in a book up until that point. And also because the woman is really unlikable in many, many ways. But I mean, that kind of ties into Leonore Shriver herself, who is a slightly, we won't get into that, but you know, characters, especially women, this expectation that we all have to be likable the whole goddamn time is exhausting to me, because a lot of male characters in fiction are not likable. Like if you read The Road by Cormac McCarthy, the dad's a douchebag in that, but he's also a douchebag in survival mode, and he cares about his kid. Like, you don't have to be an outwardly charming, likable, nice human being to be a protagonist in a story where the worst is expected to happen around you. So I read it before I had a baby, and then for some bizarre reason, I had this desperate urge to read it while I was pregnant.
Oh.
And I think it's because I sort of secretly knew I was having a boy. That I'd seen the scan and I'd seen the obvious signs that I was having a boy, and it wasn't like public knowledge, but I knew I was having a boy. I just intuition and seeing the scan and whatever. And I decided to torture myself by reading this book again. And oh my God, it hit differently as the kind of mother of a boy. Because you're right, like the weight of responsibility the character felt for the behavior of her child, even though objectively on paper she did everything that she could to be a good mother, and she tried with him. The fact that she couldn't connect and she couldn't reach him, and the outcome of that
Mm-hmm.
and the alienation he obviously felt throughout his entire life growing up,
Yeah.
and how her personality played off of his. And so like the whole, like, where do you apportion blame in that scenario, and her full acceptance of that, and the way that she's shunned by society after what happens and so on. It's just, there's so much in there that horrified me
Yeah.
and made me deeply, deeply sad as well, particularly because she has 2 children in the novel, and the bond she has with her second child, who is a girl, is so completely different and soft and natural, and it's how it should be for her. And she finally gets an experience of how motherhood should feel, according to all the things she's ever been told. And that's taken away from her. And it's just, there's so much there. It's such a fucking tragic novel in so many levels, and it's so well done, and it's so brilliantly written.
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
we'll talk. I think that's one of your picks. So I have a lot to say.
Yeah.
Then, have you seen the movie adaptation?
I have, yeah. And I have to say, I think Tilda Swinton like nailed it.
She did.
Absolutely nailed it, and just, yeah, she was exactly how I envisaged the character in my head, I think.
Yeah, she really did capture exactly how I had pictured Ava. And I mean, maybe it was a little foretelling of Ezra Miller, but
right, yeah. I wasn't gonna like. It's so hard to not go into like other people's personalities, but like, how can you not, with everything that he has become? And maybe there's a reason why he was able to portray that character so well on screen. I don't know. Maybe there's something there. They resonated with. Beg your pardon. And yeah, it's just, there's so much there, isn't there, in all of it.
Yeah. Well, it was also just such a beautiful movie, and
yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I think it would just be interesting if you're like an intro to film teacher to talk about like color theory and like the movie The Color Red, and that
right. I was going to talk about the color grading in that is beautiful from start to finish, because there's also a lot of blues that like seep in, and it's just cleverly done. And yeah, it's like everything in her life afterwards is just really pallid and grey and blue and bleak and dreary. And it's a good film. It's such a good film. It's a horrible film, but it's also a beautiful film, like you said.
I mean, there's a ton of movies we could talk about, but I don't know. I also have it. My doc is the Google Doc is a representation of my brain. It is like I have subheadings that I don't have subheadings. It is just a jumbled mess. So I have that under that, but I also have under motherhood. We have the horrors of losing yourself or a loss of identity. I think a few of the books that I've picked kind of fall under that. And then we talked earlier, the horrors of like having a toxic mother.
Yeah.
And then we have those fears of possibly the fear of repeating the cycle.
Yeah. And becoming your own parent, which I think is inevitable as much as you try hard for it not to be.
Oh man. Well, what were some other movies featuring motherhood and horror?
There is a really interesting one from the 50s, and the name has just gone straight out of my head, but it stars oh my god, she's like an axe wielding, oh my god, what's it called? This is going to be really embarrassing. I need to look it up. I think it's Joan Collins, not Joan Collins. She's an axe murderer, and it's really interesting because she's basically jealous of her daughter's marriage. Oh, what the hell is it called? Oh, there we go. What's it? It's Joan Crawford, Straight Jacket.
Oh, okay.
There we go. So
I'm not familiar with this.
Joan Crawford in Straight Jacket. And so Joan Crawford plays this kind of, I guess, older mother figure who's quite glamorous in many ways. And she obviously still cares about her appearance and how she's perceived and comes across. But the main thrust of the narrative is this younger couple, and I forget whether it's her daughter or her son. Either way, there is a younger woman in the farm, and Joan Crawford's character becomes insanely jealous of their relationship. And it's about kind of mothers being displaced, I believe, and or also jealous. And the end result is that she goes on a bit of an axe murdering rampage. And it's such an interesting film. Like, visually, it's a really interesting film. But the themes that it explores about that toxic motherhood, it's very much in line with Psycho. The kind of... is it Bloch who wrote Psycho? I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, the idea of, again, exploring this kind of nagging, intrusive, overbearing mother that had such a poor influence on you that you then, horrible, violent things ensue.
Yeah.
And so I would say that's those two are good honorable mentions.
I'll have to check that one out. I was not familiar with that one. I have The Bad Seed on here. I do have a soft spot for The Bad Seed. Which is another, like, how much do you blame yourself for an evil child? And I mean, if you've read the book, it kind of brings up this novel idea of like nature versus nurture, and like the adults are having like their neighbors over and having this like big psychological discussion of like, oh, they're saying like, actually, there's a big debate going on over what it is. And then as you learn more about the mother, and she kind of discovers like, oh, maybe there is something in my nature, and I passed this on to my child, and the problem is me.
Yeah.
It's very interesting. Also, Rhoda Penmark, icon. In the worst way.
that nature versus nurture thing, if you're like me and you listen to billions of true crime podcast episodes every weekend, which I really need to stop doing, because it doesn't make me sleep very well. But like, it's so interesting to me that some people that grow up to do horrific things, can actually have quite good upbringings, and they can have quite loving mothers who go on to defend them right until the end and stand by them, even though their children have done these horrendous things. But the difference between that and then people who have obviously grown up in a really abusive environment, like, there seems to be no answer to the question of nature versus nurture. Like, obviously, if you're a child subjected to abuse, there is a very good chance that you will then go on to act that out somehow. But there are also many children subjected to horrendous parenting who grow up to not do that. It's such a weird dichotomy.
To this day, we haven't. It's not cut and dry.
It's not, is it? And it's so interesting because, like, psychologists, behavioralists are all fascinated with this nature versus nurture thing, but there seems to be no definitive it's one way or the other. It's...
I don't know. Just want to know who to blame, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's it, isn't it? It's accountability, which is the whole point of... Not the whole point, but it's the whole... When you become a parent, everything becomes the language of accountability, and then guilt. Guilt's another one that I was going to talk about as well with motherhood, because it's like somebody flicks a switch the second you give birth. You're suddenly just guilty about everything. And how that comes out in different ways as well, I think, is interesting.
This just reminds me of another... Jude Ellison wrote a book called like Dead Blondes and Bad Mothers.
Okay, no, I've not heard of that.
So he got into like the different portrayals, and it's essentially like the three ways that like women are perceived, and it's like, like the vixen, the crone, and the hag. But he has a whole chapter on evil mothers, and how like even with serial killers and like Ed Gein and stuff like this, we still find a way to bring their mothers into this and somehow still blame it
and blame them. Women. I mean, Ed Gein is a really good example of like the complexity of the relationship he had with his mother, where for a good long stretch of time he sort of kind of idolized her but also hated her. It was a really odd and very inappropriate connection. And how much of that was driven by her, and how much can you blame her for his deeds? And, it's like you said, it's like there needs to be a fault.
Yeah.
There always needs to be a fault. I also, one of the things we haven't touched on, which is really interesting to me, it's a bit of a kind of tangent, but I wonder how much of like that whole period of time of the persecution of women and mothers as witches is tied in with motherhood and themes of motherhood and responsibility and accountability. And you know what I mean? Like, just there's a lot of blame apportioned to women throughout history, particularly in that period of time. Almost like we're looking for an excuse to blame women for other people's behaviors as a form of kind of coercion or control. And we take on a lot of that blame. We really do, in many insidious kind of daily ways. And I don't think that's often explored a lot. That kind of assumed guilt.
I mean, I try not to bring my religious trauma into every episode. I really don't. But I mean, that's a lot of the way when you're deep into, especially the sect of religion I was in, you know, women are blamed for men's discretions often.
Right.
And it's
I think something we need to add to this list is a film I've literally just seen called Women Talking, which hit me like a dozen punches to the face. It's at once a very beautiful and slow kind of exposition piece, almost like a stage play, and on the other hand, it's this horrible, violent, visceral, the things that happen to these women, and who then go on to sort of rationalize and debate in a very calm and genteel manner the incredibly awful things that are done to them in the name of religion, but also just toxic masculinity. Well, not even toxic masculinity, violent masculinity. I think the word toxic's overused sometimes when men are just being violent towards women. And the rape and abuse and then, worse things that happen in that film are explored so wonderfully by a collection of women who are all mothers or should have been. Or their children, female children who will grow up in theory to be mothers themselves, particularly by the laws of this religion. So it's an incredibly tough movie to sit through, I found, but a really important one just for the way it's handled. It's handled beautifully. It's it will stay with me for a while. Like we need to talk about Kevin Will. It will stay with me for a long while.
It's on my to watch list, but I'll bump it up.
You need to be in the right frame of mind. And if you're somebody that needs to read the content warnings before, then do. I would say.
Yeah. I mean, from what I know about it, I think that makes sense. I think one of the big ones too in recent memory, The Babadook.
Yes, that's the one that people traditionally talk about. I think when you do your sort of motherhood and horror, and for good reason. It's an interesting one for me because it's about a mother struggling with a son who's acting out because of grief, and she's struggling with her own grief, and the grief is sort of manifests as this creature, the Babadook. It's an interesting one for me because at the end of the film, she doesn't vanquish the beast or defeat it. She kind of just learns to live with it. It becomes another child, like a child that's locked up in the basement that she feeds. But because she comes to terms with this grief and with these feelings by just accepting that they're a part of her now. And I find that a really interesting exploration of a lot of things that happen to you when you become a mother. Like you were talking about loss of identity. Mm-hmm. At some point when you're a mum, you learn to let go of that old version of you. You fight it for a lot of years. You want to get it back. You want that old, you want your old figure back. You want your old carelessness back. You want your old sense of humor back and all these things, but they ain't coming back because you've changed. You've been through one of the most radical physical and emotional changes of your entire life. And you've got a kid and you've got responsibilities and everything in your life has shifted. And so learning to accept that is a big part of motherhood. And it's one of the most difficult parts that I found to accept, was that old version of me was never coming back. But it's okay because the new version of me, I'm now, I have accommodated and I've locked her up in the basement.
You go down and give her treats.
I do. I go and feed her a big glass of gin every evening at the end of a long day. And it's a really interesting one, that.
Yeah. I think some of my picks get into that a little bit, I think especially like feeling the loss of your creative self,
Right.
but just learning that it has a new form now. It just looks differently
Yeah.
than it did before.
Yeah. And how can you express it given all
Mhm.
the other pressures and things going on? And yeah.
There's so much and it's so broad, and I don't want to feel like we're missing something, but there's just no way we're going to be able to cover
No.
everything and all the ways that horror can manifest in horror, that motherhood can manifest
Yeah.
in horror, or just the different horrors of, attempt like a infertility journey. I mean,
Right.
there's so much. And I wanted to mention, speaking of Jude Ellison, I was talking about him earlier. I had read this, it came from the closet, and this is Queer Reflections on Horror Movies. And, he talked about how becoming pregnant was kind of his wake up call for like, I don't feel comfortable in my body anymore. Like,
Right. Yeah.
I need to transition. Like, I have never felt like everything they're telling me I'm supposed to feel about gestating a pregnancy in this
Right.
time in my life.
Yeah. I
You
mean,
know?
I have a lot of empathy for that. I found pregnancy terrifying in that it gave me the worst body dysmorphia that I've ever had in my life. And I still now have days where I look in the mirror and I don't recognize who I am or what I'm supposed to look like. The version of me that I can take a nice selfie of doesn't look anything like the version of me that I actually see. My body changed, like structurally changed. Like my rib cage is wider. Like my
Mm-hmm.
shoulders are more rounded. My hips are wide. Like everything about me changed. And at a
Yeah.
halfway mark, kind of, well, actually, no, 30 years in, and that's actually terrifying because you suddenly have to like get used to an entirely new frame.
Yeah.
And yeah, the level of like discomfort I still feel in my own body, and I feel like an alien sometimes. So like, yeah, I completely get that. I completely get that needing to, I think, transform into something that makes you feel less alone in your own self, if that
Mm-hmm.
makes sense. Yeah.
There's a girl I went to college with, and she has, I think, like 6 or 7 kids. And like the few times she's had a baby, she'll post like throwback pictures of herself pregnant. She says, like, I love being pregnant and I miss being pregnant, and I've never
Yeah.
related to anything less.
No, and actually, I'm the same. I had a horrendous pregnancy. I was really uncomfortable. I was really big. I was just everything went wrong with it that could have gone wrong. I wish that I had had a glowy, lovely. Like I've got friends who are loving every second of being pregnant, and I'm so happy for them.
Mm-hmm.
Like I would never wish my experience on anyone else. I do wish I'd had a chance at a pregnancy where I had felt less like a sack of pain.
Yeah.
But I just felt like a big blister
Yeah.
for 9 months. It was horrendous.
I just think it's very unglamorous. And, I had a lot of close friends that were struggling with infertility. So I did not want to
Right.
bring my
You
like,
don't want to voice that, do
pregnancy
you?
sucks. Or it's like,
Right.
this is the
Yeah.
one thing they want.
Yeah. And this is what I'm talking about. This is why a lot of women don't speak out about their particular individual experiences, because you're always aware that somebody else is going through a very different journey. But one of the things I learned in therapy, and a very important lesson for me, was I would always sit down and the therapist would say, okay, so tell me what you're struggling with this week. And I would voice what I was struggling with, but then I would immediately mitigate it and go, but I feel
Yeah.
like I'm complaining about this when people have got things so much worse in so many other different ways. And every time I said that, the therapist would kind of verbally rap me over the knuckles, because other people's experiences being horrendous and difficult doesn't invalidate yours and your feelings. Everything to do with how you feel and how you're struggling is completely valid in your world and in your life too. That being said, you want to be mindful of people around you who are having a hard time, particularly with pregnancy, because it's such a charged, emotionally charged thing, right? But I also I don't think in the right setting that women shouldn't talk about the negative aspects of something that, the prevailing sentiment is still this very old-fashioned view of, well, women have been having babies for thousands of years, just it's normal and natural, just stop complaining and get on with it. I'm like, well, yes, but women's average life expectancy for thousands of years was vastly lower than men's in many ways because of childbirth and childbirth related conditions, and mental health rates and all these things. Like, we need to just be more open to the discourse, I think. And I think the way that will help is that if you are feeling like a big old bloated blister like I did, you won't beat yourself up so much because you're not enjoying the experience, because you're not grateful enough. Like, yes, I am grateful. Of course I'm grateful. I'm growing a new life in my belly. It's just really also really fucking hard, and I'm struggling, and that's okay.
Yeah.
And there's a lot more compassion I think we could have on a wider scale if we were all much more comfortable with being able to talk about our individual experiences. And that's why I think these kind of books and movies are important in a way.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of just binary thinking that that is placed upon motherhood, where like, if you voice this, that must mean this. And it's
right,
like,
exactly.
I can feel angry and dissatisfied, or whatever we'll get into with these books that touch upon, and still love my child. It's not an either or.
I can be many things all at once, and I find that is a very common thing for the without gendering it too much, the kind of female experience, as I have experienced it, is that people often expect you to be one thing or the other. And it's like, well, no, I can be many things all at once, actually. And that's just life. It's nuanced and complex. And, pigeonholes and labels and boxes and all that stuff I've never been a big fan of anyway. And
Well, I was looking at movies that feature motherhood, and I was trying to watch some, and man, are they all dark for the most part.
Yes.
I will say I did watch Prevenge, came out in 2016, which is
I
a
love
dark
that film.
comedy. Yes, I was going to ask you.
I love that film. I followed it's Alice Lowe, I believe. I followed her for a while online. She's been kind of a regular feature on TV shows and comedy shows over here for a long time. And she's quite sort of vocal on Twitter and an advocate for kind of women's rights, particularly women's rights in the film industries and how women are portrayed in films and things. And so, this film was a lovely little dark indie gem, which starts off funny and then really isn't. Like, it's really uncomfortable in many ways, but it's essentially her character is a pregnant woman who's revenging herself upon the people responsible for her husband's death before the child is born. And like that theme of revenge tends to be the revenge with women tends to be done in a number of ways. It's either kind of Glenn Close style, like bunnies boiling in a pan, like kind of, although God, I root for her in that film so much. Like, poor woman. Michael Douglas deserved everything he got. But like, do you know what I'm saying? Like, women in revenge films are either the bad, evil, crazy one getting revenge because they've been jilted or whatever, or it's the domain of man. You're looking at the big blockbuster action movie where the man gets revenge and like Gerard Butler runs around killing everybody that ever wronged him. But this lovely like moment where there's a pregnant woman who feels very righteous about what she's doing, and she's on a mission to seek revenge in a very masculine way, but she sort of does it in quite a feminine way as well. Like, it's a really interesting little movie, that one. Like, I don't think you're supposed to read too deeply into it. Like, I think it is what it is, but I will say, it's a great film. It's really enjoyable for me to watch as a woman in many ways.
It was, I think, the lightest fare.
Yeah.
That I watched into this. Yeah. And then the idea that she thinks it's her unborn child telling her that this is
right,
what needs
because
to be done.
That's how she's rationalized it. And it's so interesting that she's a mother in a film who is not objectively evil, and she's not objectively like helpless like the woman is in Rosemary's Baby. Like, she's actually like, she's doing something. This is how she feels, and she's doing something about it. And I quite like that. She's taking control, and there's action involved.
Yeah. Well, should we talk about some books?
Yes.
My first pick is Nightbitch by Rachel Yoder. We follow an unnamed narrator. She's an artist who is now a full time stay at home parent. She finds it pretty lonely and exhausting. Her husband is always away on business trips, and she feels like she's on the brink of losing her mind. But instead, she finds that she's gained canines, a strange appetite, a new voice, and she believes she might be turning into a werewolf. You read this one?
I haven't read it, but I've read the theme immediately gets under my skin.
This book does have so much rage, and I think it really draws that line of like, this is my honest like anger at like all these responsibilities that are now dropped onto me. And I think a lot of societal rage, and that she's mad that her husband doesn't feel the need to just like pick up the slack.
Right.
And how empowering it is for her to turn into this werewolf and kind of becoming this animal. She finds that she can dig into her creativity again. She finds that she has more assertiveness to like tell her husband, like, no, I'm going to go here and you're doing this.
Right.
Like,
kind of like Teen Wolf, but they're an older audience. Like,
yeah. And it touches on the loneliness of being like, you know, a professional to going to like a suburban stay-at-home mom.
Well, that's exactly what comes out in We Need to Talk About Kevin as well, like without jumping ahead too much. Like both women are professionals, they're intelligent, they have their lives set up in a way that makes them comfortable, and then they're thrust into motherhood and all of that goes away and it's really lonely. And I've been there 100%. Like I was a marketing manager in a number of like kind of businesses before, and I went from wearing a nice suit and getting paid regularly and having benefits and talking about grown-up stuff to being covered in sick all day and being on my own and talking goo goo gaga language for days on end without speaking to another adult. And it made me so angry. I was really, really angry a lot of the time. Particularly I've been the person who has been at home looking after the baby whilst my husband's been away on business trips. And the level of resentment that I felt, he was working. To be honest, he was working. He wasn't off on a jolly, although every now and then he would text me pictures of like a nice glass of red wine that he was having on the Spanish Steps in Rome or whatever. The level of resentment I felt was visceral and all-consuming, because I was like, well, I'm here, I'm covered in diarrhea, I haven't washed for 3 days, the baby's been screaming for hours on end, like, you know. And also because women, we don't raise children in a village anymore, you know. We don't have our families living with us, not many women now. And we have friends, sure, and we might have a baby group to lean on and stuff, but a lot of us are just doing this alone. It's insanely isolating. And I think when you're isolated and alone, you get scared. And when you're scared, you get angry. So it all plays into each other.
Oh, it absolutely does. And I think this bridges that gap with what we were talking earlier of like feeling that resentment and fully feeling that rage, but that not meaning you don't.
Right. You love your child. You know, you wouldn't want it to, well, you would want it to be a different way. Yeah. But you don't regret the decision to be a mother, unless perhaps it has been something that you didn't plan for, which is a whole nother section of like fiction, is like unplanned stuff. Yeah. But like you can love somebody and also still feel like you're losing yourself in that relationship, whether it's romantically, whether it's a parent-child relationship, whether it's just by default of getting older and discovering who you are a little bit more. Like it's entirely possible to love somebody but also feel trapped by them, you know? Yeah.
I do have a quote. I think it's kind of long. It's like, she wanted to tell the girl, it's complicated. I am now a person I never imagined I would be, and I don't know how to square that. I would like to be content, but instead I'm stuck inside a prison of my own creation, where I torment myself endlessly until I am left binge eating Fig Newtons at midnight to keep from crying. I feel as though societal norms, gendered expectations, and the infuriating bluntness of biology have forced me to become this person, even though I am having a hard time parsing how, precisely, I arrived at this place. I am angry all the time. I would one day like to direct my own artwork toward a critique of these modern day systems that articulates all this. But my brain no longer functions as it did before the baby. And I'm really dumb now. And I'm afraid I'll never be smart or happy or thin again. I'm afraid I might be turning into a dog. Instead, she said, smiling, I love it. I love being a mom.
Yeah, that got me. Like, so much of what she said, that whole fear that you're turning dumb. My God, that's such a real... When you go from having like intellectual conversations with friends over a glass of wine in the pub in the evening about this and that and politics and expressionism and all the rest of it, to literally teaching your kid ABC and watching the Night Garden or whatever the equivalent that you guys have, like, you know, I don't know cartoons, but like the world, particularly of small babies, but actually also small children, can be endlessly boring and inane in so many ways. And you can feel your intellectual capacity drain away. Like, you really can feel it just disappear off out of your body. And it's really sad. Like, it's a muscle that you need to continually train, and you don't get a chance to train it when you're looking after a small child. You do later on. It does come back. But yeah, for that moment in time when all you want to talk about is something like meaningful and intense, and instead you've just got to say, please eat your sandwich 19 times in a row.
So yeah, needless to say, I absolutely loved this book. It is a weird one, so I think you just have to know that going in, that it's just a book full of rage, full of feelings, and it's a little weird, but I loved it. I would say room temperature, it's nothing really frightening as much as it's like an exploration of these feelings and sometimes the feral thing we need to turn into.
That animalism as well is an interesting one, because you do become a bit feral. Like, you sort of stop looking after yourself. You you know, you pretty much like scavenge for food without like ever cooking nice things for yourself. Like, it's basically a game of survival in the early days. Particularly, I think, if you're a single mother as well, or a single parent.
Oh, yeah.
Because I think the idea of motherhood, and I know this is contentious, but motherhood can also include fathers. And I know that sounds weird, but I know what I mean by that. But like that act of caring for something, and that being your sole responsibility. You do go a bit, you become a bit of an animal.
That was Nightbitch by Rachel Yoder.
I think my first pick is going to be, it's going to be The Yellow Wallpaper, which is everybody knows it. It's a classic. It's interesting because I've always kind of I studied this book at university, and Charlotte Perkins Gilman has always been on my radar as somebody I looked up to. I have since found out, as these things happen, that a lot of her personal views were quite problematic. I believe she was quite a racist individual. So I am aware of that now. So it hasn't changed my relationship with the book, but it has changed the way perhaps that I think about the person who wrote it. But also, I think for the purposes of this interview, I'm going to just separate that out for a moment, because it is, again, it's an small epistolary story which explores the intimate impact of postnatal depression on a woman who is surrounded by men, and surrounded by men who fundamentally misunderstand the nature of her condition. So she is very much patronized, spoken down to, kind of gaslit in a lot of ways, and all of that treatment and that kind of patriarchal influence just serves to make her more and more sick. So she, you know, as a new mother, she's kind of locked in a room, and she stays in that room, and she's not really allowed much exercise, much intellectual discourse with other people. She's kept alone and isolated on a strict diet of bed rest. And the end result of that is that she starts to, you know, manifest these horrible visions of a creeping woman in the wallpaper. And that woman is obviously kind of her. She sees herself trapped behind these horrendous, like, ugly, scrolling, florid patterns. And it's a very short exploration of a slow decline in mental health, which I find horrifying on many, many levels, purely because there are so many occasions in this book where she openly states what she thinks she needs for her own mental health, and it's just ignored, outright ignored. There are so many quotes I've got here, like just so many instances where she's just, her own needs aren't met because people don't believe that she knows what's good for her. There's one instance where, sort of in the early days, the main protagonist is kind of, she's starting to feel unwell. They've moved to this kind of new house in the countryside, which it looks pretty on the surface, but to all intents and purposes is a prison. You know, she repeatedly uses imagery, and she talks about bars on windows, but also the fact that the trees and the shrubbery surrounding the house kind of feel like prison walls. And there's a growing sense of disquiet that she tries to have a conversation with her husband about at one point. And she sort of tries to talk to him. And the words she uses, she says, the quote is, "Dear John, he loves me very dearly and hates to have me sick. I tried to have a real, earnest, reasonable talk with him the other day and tell him how I wish he would let me go and make a visit to cousin Henry and Julia." And she's basically begging to be let out of the house because she wants to be around other people. Mm-hmm. But he said I wasn't able to go, nor able to stand it after I got there, and I did not make out a very good case for myself, for I was crying before I had finished. And that's just like one example of where she's immediately gaslit into like thinking that she's at fault for not being able to be strong enough to go and visit her cousin, when actually what he wants is for her to stay put so he can keep a close eye on her. And he's completely disregarding what she thinks is good for her own mental health. He probably thinks he's being kind and loving and caring, but at the same time it's about control and it's about coercion. And there's so many, it's such a short book, like there's so many instances of where a doctor comes and talks to John, and neither of them really talk to her. They just talk over her or around her or in different rooms to her. And so as this is unfolding and as she is repeatedly not being heard and becomes more and more isolated, her kind of paranoid fantasies get worse and worse and worse. And it's just, I've kind of personally been in a position where I found it very hard to communicate my own needs, particularly in those early days. And it absolutely did contribute to my own decline in many ways, you know? I'm not saying that I was gaslit or misunderstood, because I absolutely wasn't. But I found it very, very difficult to communicate and be my own advocate. And that's essentially what's going on here. And so for that instance, it's quite a horrifying book for me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, also that she's blaming herself for showing emotion.
Right.
At all, that she should be taken less seriously because she cried.
Yeah, and this whole notion of the time it was written, I think it was the 1790s or something like that. This whole notion of hysterical women as well was a real thing back then, which is another form of kind of entrenched gaslighting, where if a woman displays any sort of emotion, then she's got hysteria, you know, and it's like, well, actually, no, she's justifiably upset and angry and feeling out of control. And yeah, so it's just it's a very good example of that slow, and she uses the word slow creeping quite a lot, creeping women, as a kind of metaphor, I think, for women in society in general who were just brought down very low by the expectations and also by the act of just not being heard, until they're reduced to these figures who creep around, you know, along the floor and around in the background. Yeah. And the kind of final denouement of that whole thing is she does start to creep herself to mimic the character she thinks she sees in the wallpaper. And her husband kind of comes in and witnesses this kind of act of, I guess, insanity. And he's horrified. And that's how it ends. And it's like, well, dude, You know, you kind of reap what you sow here. But it will still be her fault that throughout all of that, he'll have believed he did everything he could have to help her, and
Yeah.
it's still her fault.
So where would you rate that on the temperature scale?
Oh, I don't know. The physical reaction I get from it makes me feel like it's a cold book, but the intensity of the topic and also how timely it was, given when it was written, it's a hot one. Can it be both? Can it be like an
Yeah.
ice cream baked Alaska thing?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Well, my next book is Motherthing by Ainsley Hogarth. This is about a woman named Abby who moves into her mother in law's house with her husband, Ralph. She expects her mother in law to be a mother figure to her after her traumatic childhood, but finds her new mother in law is a narcissistic and manipulative woman who sees her as a threat to her son. At the beginning of the story, it starts off after the mother in law takes her own life. Ralph, her husband, is depressed, and Abby becomes convinced that the ghost of the mother in law is haunting the basement. She works at a nursing home, and kind of around the same time, she becomes obsessed with an older woman in her nursing home and the idea of her being a mother to Abby and what that could have been like. And she will go to whatever lengths to keep that relationship.
Oh, there's a lot there.
This is a dark comedy. It's very funny. It's very voicey, but Abby is absolutely fascinating as a narrator because I feel this way about a lot of books where I'm like, I just want you to go to therapy, honey. Like, there's obviously things that you need to work through.
There's so many books like that where you feel like this could have all been solved if you'd just gone to therapy. Like,
Yes, because with Abby, it's very much that she has this mother wound that
right.
she keeps looking for replacements for. She didn't find it with her mother-in-law.
No, and you need
And
that nurture, and you're constantly
yeah.
seeking. That's very much when you look at like TikTok videos of anxious attachment styles
Mhm.
versus whatever the other style is, and it all traces back to those parent wounds where you
Yeah.
didn't feel like a fundamental need was being met as a child.
Yes.
Yeah, and how it colors everything.
Oh, it gets so much into that. Like the first mother thing that she had was this like dingy couch that she grew up with, and she would just lay on it and touch like the same part, and that would give her a sense of comfort. And she came to call this couch like a mother thing, and she found this like old 50s cookbook in a dump, and she kind of became obsessed with this like 1950s like idealized like if I'm just the perfect mother and I like feed my husband the perfect meal and like give him a son, everything will be perfect. Everything will be
Right.
this like
Yeah.
1950s idealized. And you're in her head, like hearing her thoughts as she
Yeah.
um, has this weird way of looking at the world. And she's a very funny narrator. I had like a quote here that was just um, women on daytime murder shows are always strangled or stabbed or chopped up for no reason at all, except that they're women, I guess. And to some men, that means they deserve it. Women are lucky to get shot, really. I'd rather be shot than strangled. Thank you, son of Sam. You were uncharacteristically good to us. That's what I mean. Just a dark
Oh,
humor, a
that's
very
dark.
dark.
That's. I tell you what, though, that couching those difficult things that you feel as a woman with humor as a way of like kind of being able to cope with it more easily is quite chilling in itself, isn't it? Like,
Yeah.
you know, there's I talk about this a lot, but the ideal, the kind of misquoted Margaret Atwood quote that in relationships. Men are scared of being laughed at, and women are scared of being killed.
Yeah.
That's not the actual quote. It's all very much taken out of context, but it's that thing that you live with. Like that fear is constantly there.
Yeah.
I wonder how much that fear is heightened as well when you become a mother, or when you are in a situation as a child when your mother isn't perhaps doing what they need to, with that extra element of fear and
Yeah.
vulnerability comes into play. That then changes who you are as an adult. You know, like.
Yeah. There's a lot there. And there's just so many layers to this that, like, when I finished this book, I really sat and stared at a wall. for a good like 30 minutes thinking about things because things just keep getting ramped up.
Yeah.
And like the old lady at the nursing home, the daughter wants to move her to a different nursing home. And she's like, oh no, like we can't let this happen.
Yeah.
But like,
Yeah.
in her twisted logic, she's like, this just can't happen. And she tries to talk to the woman's daughter who's like, listen, like the view you have of my mom was not the mom she was to me. Like I didn't have a perfect childhood because she was my mom. And like, I don't know why you're projecting all this
Yeah.
stuff onto her. She wasn't this person.
Yeah. That's that reminds me of the what's it called? Is it Single White Female?
Yeah.
Where again there's obviously a big wound there, whether it's related to parents or whatever, but she just tries to constantly recreate the relationships she's obviously never had and the friendships that she's never had, but it just comes out in increasingly freaky, toxic ways. Yeah.
I had a quote here, which kind of gets into her relationship with that. It's like, what if Mrs. Bondi had been my mother instead? What might I have inherited from her? Good things. Maybe I would have wanted to be like her instead of how it is with my mother, where everything I do is to try not to be like her, which is basically the same as becoming her in a way.
Yeah.
How a shadow of your hand is both your hand and its opposite.
Wow. Yeah. That, and there's an inevitability as well. It doesn't matter how hard you try, there's always going to be a part of you that turns into your own parents in some way, shape, or form, even if you don't want, even if you go well out of your way to make sure that doesn't happen. There is a certain inevitability to it, which, yeah.
In the Gerald's Game episode, I think it was something Sarah said where she's like, if you go your whole life and make every decision to not be your parents, you are still basing every decision on them. Like they are
Yes,
still the main driving force
in your
of who
life.
you are. Of your
Absolutely.
life.
Yeah. This, yeah. That gets me for reasons that I probably won't explore here until I've gone through them with a therapist. But yeah, wow, that's. I'm actually a bit speechless just because it resonates. Yeah.
Needless to say, I love this dark little little book. When I finished it, I thought of the movie May. I think it came out in like 2001. It's kind of the weird. Have you seen that?
I haven't, no.
No, I think it's just because we're following a protagonist that has a very naive, kind of simple narrative of the world and how that translates into her interacting with other people
Yeah.
and it being kind of like a dark, funny story because of that.
Yeah.
But I think those would pair well together. Motherthing and May. I think because they're both protagonists that have just intense loneliness.
Yeah, but also have rationalized quite irrational things in a very simplistic, almost childlike way, because they've perhaps never done the work or been able to do the work in maturing because they haven't had that example. Yeah.
So that is Motherthing by Ainsley Hogarth.
My next pick is the short story Don't Look Now by Daphne du Maurier. This is about something that we haven't touched on yet is motherhood when you've lost a child. So when you're no longer a mother, but you never stop being a mother despite the loss of a child. And it's so I'm obsessed with Daphne du Maurier. Particularly her short story collections, which for me, I mean, Rebecca is one of my favourite novels of all time, but the short story collections are where she really flexes her muscles in terms of the themes and the conciseness of her writing. And my goodness, she doesn't hold back. I mean, there's quite a lot of stories that deal with things like incest. It just like no topic is off the table for her, but du Maurier understood how people worked, and she was a big observer of like the human condition, and she wrote a lot about interpersonal relationships. And so this is a particularly good one. A lot of her short stories are based on travels that she's obviously had, which resonates with me as somebody that's traveled a lot. And she obviously was fortunate enough to go most of the way around the world and around Europe, as many people did back then when you had money. And she then used those experiences to kind of inform her individual stories. And this one, there's also a movie with Julie Christie and Donald Sutherland, which is very good. This is a little bit different to the movie, but it's about a couple who have just lost a child in a terrible accident in the movie, and in the short story, I believe he gets sick, or she gets sick and passes away. Because again, child mortality kind of 100 years ago was much higher, and the couple are really struggling with grief. They have an existing child who is in boarding school, as they all were in England back in those days. And they decide to leave him in school and go travelling. And they end up in Venice. And whilst they're in Venice, the mother, who is obviously really struggling, bumps into this unusual couple of older ladies who are twins, and they're actually psychic twins, and they build an immediate rapport with her, and they start to communicate bad things that are happening, and she takes this to heart, and there becomes a big disconnect between her kind of escalating sense of fear and paranoia, because she's convinced something bad is about to happen, and the husband's kind of, don't we have enough things to worry about at the moment? Yeah. I'm trying to just get through the day and deal with my feelings. And there's a lot of very British buttoned down repression of emotion. And it's about a couple who are struggling to sort of reconnect with each other. And they sort of do. And there are moments of high romance where they're really into each other. And then it's all kind of ripped apart again because the memory of the loss of the child comes back up. And it's a really interesting look at a fragile woman who is not dealing with the loss of her child very well, and as a result is clinging on to any sort of, I guess, paranormal influence to help her cope. And the end of the story is again, it's quite different from the film, but it's basically there's a serial killer running around Venice, killing people. So yeah, there's a lot of things at play. It's not like an openly paranormal story, but it sort of is. There's hints of it, and really, it's just how it doesn't matter where you are. That grief can play out on any stage, like the beautiful city of Venice versus being at home in a locked room, and that sense of loss and purposelessness as well, which like her purpose has sort of been taken away from her a bit, particularly as her other child is older and he's off at school and he's already being cared for there. And there's one point in the story where that child gets sick too. And immediately the panic that comes over her that I'm going to lose another child, which then escalates what sort of subsequently happens. So it's a really fascinating look at grief and motherhood, I think. But just dealt with in that very British buttoned up way where we're not really allowed to feel anything. We're still not. It's still a problem today.
Where would you rank that temperature wise?
I would say that's a, if we're talking about the characters and the exploration of kind of love and familial love and husband and wife relationships and motherhood, that's kind of a warmer temperature. But if we're talking about the warmer temperature. Sorry, I totally lost track there.
No, you're totally fine. That's been on my TBR forever.
This short story collection is wild, and you will fly through it. And again, it's of a certain time. It's of a certain era where people of a certain level of society had lots of disposable income, and they travelled, and they were very educated. And it's mostly a lot of people who are educated and travel a lot. But there's still some incredibly interesting themes and dealt with, and there's nobody writes quite like her. I've got a novella coming out from Polis later on this year, which is kind of my love letter tribute to du Maurier and how she writes and the things that she writes about. So
I love that. I do like Daphne du Maurier.
Yeah.
All right. My last pick is a 2023 release. It is The Graveyard of Lost Children by Katrina Monroe. At 4 months old, Olivia Dahl was almost murdered. Driven by haunting visions, her mother became obsessed with the idea that Olivia was a changeling, and the only way to get her real baby back was to make a trade with the dead women living at the bottom of the well. Now Olivia is ready to give birth to a daughter of her own, and for the first time, she hears the women whispering. So this does deal with a lot of postpartum depression. And I think the idea that everyone tells Olivia that she should be happy, she should be glowing, like this is the best time of your life. And the way that Katrina Monroe writes, it took me back to that place of like when you're a mom with an infant, and we talked about earlier, you're overwhelmed, like you're dirty, you're sick, like you can't get your baby to latch, they're not gaining weight, you take them to checkups, and you're like
And you get
everything
told
feels
off.
like it's your
Right.
fault.
Yeah.
And I think, like, I mean, in this book, she has a supportive partner. And I think having this postpartum depression as kind of this supernatural force was a very interesting and I think good metaphor for it. And I think also that she thinks about maybe connecting with her own mother, who is this like kind of true crime figure. Like that's like a thing where like, you know, a podcast did an episode on like her mom.
Yeah. But also that her mum has passed down this inherited like bundle of anxiety and fear, and like because almost losing a child at that age would drastically alter your brain chemistry for the rest of your life. You know, it just would. And how that's been then passed down to her as she becomes a mother herself, and that again, that theme of inevitability, right? It's just so strong with stories about motherhood. It's like the inevitability that we're all going to struggle with the same shit at some point, and there's not really much you can do about it. I hate that. It's so tragic to me. Like,
it is. I mean, I think in a lot of these stories, in some of these stories, there is like an overcoming or like a, you know, I learned to put this in the basement and like now it looks this way. Like I may not be this, but now I'm this.
Yeah.
I just thought it was a very good metaphor, an interesting exploration. Like I said, the writing really put me back there. So maybe only read it when you're.
Yeah, I might need to. Yeah, I might need to be slightly older and stronger before I can go there.
But I really loved it as an exploration for that. But I remember several times I was reading it and I was like, that's dark. That's very dark. Okay. So that is The Graveyard of Lost Children by Katrina Monroe. Do you have any chilling obsessions or things you've been enjoying in horror lately?
Other than my abiding obsession with true crime podcasts, which is something I'm really going to need to consciously cut back on, because the kind of the relationship between horror, fictional horror, and actual real life horror, and in terms of the things that I consume and how they feed into each other. And I think because some of the stuff I write is based on true crime and, you know, whatever, I'm not entirely sure it's very good for my brain, like the level that I am now consuming. And I don't think that things like Netflix and stuff actually help that very much. Other obsessions I have at the moment, I am returning very much, like I said, to the short story as a way, well, partly because I'm finding it very hard to read at the moment, and I have done since I had a baby. We probably suspect my kid's old enough now to he's in referral for a potential ADHD diagnosis. One of the things that happens when you have a neurodivergent kid who also has dyslexia is that the prevailing wisdom is you also look at the parents to see if there's anything potentially undiagnosed there. And we're all fairly convinced in my circle that I've probably got some quite strenuously undiagnosed ADHD myself. So I've been doing a lot of reading about it, and it's interesting that ADHD isn't just a childhood illness. It's actually something you can develop as an adult.
Oh, I don't know that.
Which I was quite surprised to learn. And also, one of the main triggers for ADHD later on in life with women is childbirth, which is really interesting to me. And that all ties in a lot with my current interests. So the long and short of it is, as a result, I can't read long things very easily. My focus is extremely difficult to kind of muster at the moment. So audiobooks help, but short stories are my gateway back into reading. And again, I've been just churning through Du Maurier and short story collections. So that's kind of my main obsession at the moment when it comes to what I'm consuming.
I love that. I do love a good short story. And like, I understand that my son has ADHD, and, you know, we have the medication and the therapy and everything. So
yeah, it's a journey.
It's a
journey. It's a diagnosis over in the UK is for children is very long-winded and problematic and stressful. Not so much for adults, which I feel like is the wrong way around. But yeah.
Oh, it's the opposite here. Yeah. Anyway, that could be a whole nother thing.
Yeah. I'll come back for another episode and we can talk about neurodivergent horror.
Well, another tradition we have on this podcast is to ask guests for a final girl song.
Yes. And yeah, we were chatting about this earlier, and I am going to mention the song Labour that's doing the rounds on TikTok at the moment, which is an absolute earworm that I cannot shake at all. And it's essentially a very angry woman talking about all the fucking hard work she has to do because her bloke doesn't really like see her as anything more than kind of free labor. And she's everything to him. She's his therapist, she's his wife, she's his nurse, she's, you know, it's like, it just, the lyrics are wonderfully written, and it's a real thumping song that goes along at a grand old pace. And it's just, it's kind of my current obsession at the moment. Like,
it's been a female rage bop on TikTok.
Right. If you can bop along to your own rage. Yeah. I like that. I'm happy, but I'm also really angry. Yeah. Just in time.
Oh man. So where can people find you online?
So I always say this is my kind of one-liner, is that I am liberally splattered across the internet. If you type Gemma Amor into Google, you'll find me on Twitter under the handle Many Little Words, the same handle for Instagram, the same handle for TikTok, which I'm slowly learning how to use. I have a website, gemmaamorauthor.com. And I also have a Wikipedia page now, which is very gratifying, and a little IMDb page. So I'm on Facebook too. I'm in a number of places. My digital footprint will be uncovered in thousands of years' time by digital archaeologists. But yeah, so.
Right, well, thank you so much for coming on the show and talking to me about motherhood and horror.
Thank you for having me. Thank you. And I'll be better organized next time.
I wasn't either.
Right. Quite like apropos for the episode, my whole week. Because I'm a mother. I was looking after a sick kid, so my brain is just fried. But yeah.
Books in the Freezer is a bi-weekly podcast. We post episodes every other Tuesday. You can find us on Twitter at BooksFreezerPod, on Instagram and TikTok at Books in the Freezer, or you can send us an email at booksinthefreezer@gmail.com. And I would like to just add a quick apology because even though this episode is a bit longer than usual, as we got closer to the end of recording, we both had places to be and we were running out of time. So Gemma did not get to talk about, we need to talk about Kevin as one of her picks, which was something we kept saying at the top of the episode, like, oh, we'll get to it when we talk about it. So just apologies about that, but that happens sometimes. Maybe we'll just have to add that to the schedule for maybe the next time she comes on the show. We'll have to have our official talk about We Need to Talk About Kevin by Lionel Shriver. If you would like to support the podcast, there are a few ways to do that. One of them is to become a Patreon supporter at patreon.com/booksinthefreezer. There's a $1, $3, and a $5 level. And you can check out all the different perks that come at each level. I think there's also an option to do like a one-time annual payment. And I think that discounts it quite a bit. So check that out. At the $3 level, there is a Voxer group chat where we hang out and talk about the movie nights we have every so often. So if that sounds interesting to you, that's patreon.com/booksinthefreezer. You can also use the podcast affiliate links that will be listed in the show notes using services like Libro FM and getting a Fangoria subscription or Fangoria merch, or using Amazon, using the link in the show notes. All goes to help out the show. Also with Libro FM, at the end of the month, it is Independent Bookstore Day. And there's a lot of things going on with Libro FM. I'm sure I will post about it on Instagram and Twitter as it gets closer, but keep your eye on that. And if you've been considering getting Libro FM as a gift or for yourself to listen to some audiobooks, I think it's a good time to check that out. And it's always a good time to support a local independent bookstore, but I mean, come on, especially on Indie Bookstore Day, right? And a way to support the podcast without spending any money is to, of course, tell a friend about us, post about us on Instagram, Twitter, but also leaving a review on a site like Spotify or Apple Podcasts is huge. And yes, I do have another 5-star review to read, so thank you. This is from Peace Blossom. It says, "Great horror podcast, 5 stars. This podcast ticks all my boxes. Stephanie is a talented host with a lovely voice. She keeps the show moving at a balanced pace, not overly structured or too free for all. I love the guests she has on and the wide variety of subgenres that are touched on. My TBR list grows longer with each episode that comes out, and have been reading a lot of new authors and styles that I wouldn't have known about otherwise. I really enjoy the Final Girl song and Chilling Obsession traditions. I love how positive this show is in tone too, with the focus on what they like about a given topic instead of dislikes, and just the general positive vibes from Stephanie and her guests." Thank you so much for that lovely review. And if you would like to leave a review, you can go on Apple Podcasts, like I said, or Spotify. And thank you so much for those of you who have taken the time to do that. And on Apple Podcasts, it does look like 239 of you have left a rating or a rating and review. So big thank you to all of you. I would love for it to be an even 250. So if, 11 more of you could hop on there and just put a few words. You don't have to be as articulate as Peace Blossom was. If you just want to say thumbs up or anything like that would be great. But grateful for all of you. I'm Stephanie. You can find me on Twitter at lady_Ganya. That's LADY_GAGNON, or on Instagram at That's What She Read. And that's with 2 A's. So thank you so much, and see you next time on Books in the Freezer.